Hey everybody, it's Friday, September 6th. The purpose of this video is to review your second set of reading questions on the Hippocratic Oath, its history, and its challengers. The reason this is an important thing to study and get a sense of is for two reasons. First, this oath has had a profound effect historically on any number of codes of ethics that have been developed, even cross-culturally, to guide medical practice. And the second reason it's kind of fascinating to look at the oath itself, which I, of course, printed on your reading questions, and see that influence and the changes made by later codes. You'll get a richer sense of the ways in which, when people's values change, um, and as we reflect more on ethical questions literally through the centuries, we do change our codes of ethics in light of that reflection, hopefully for the better. So that's why we're studying the Hippocratic Oath. Okay, now I've already posted a written version of what we're doing here. I sat down and answered my own questions. Your answers, of course, were due last night on Thursday, so those should have been submitted by now. And then once that deadline passes, each week I am going to post my own answers to these questions. And I'll also do a video like this where I kind of talk through the material. You should watch the video or read the questions. If you really want that double dose, you can do both, but it's certainly fine to just do one or the other. I'm only grading your reading questions. I'm just checking to see that you gave it a good shot, tried to get the right answers. It's actually up to you in conjunction with either this video or my written responses to correct your understanding and email me any questions you might have. If even after reading the answers or watching the video, you still have some questions. So this kind of replaces the lecture that you get in a live class. So hopefully it's adequate for you to understand the material. And again, I'm always available for office hours or to do additional appointments. And I've provided a written version and a video version just in case, one of them is easier for you to access. Not everybody has great internet access. Okay, so our method here will be pretty simple. I'm simply going to put on screen, I'm going to share the kind of what I've written out, and I'm going to talk it through a little bit. All right, so everybody go ahead, just get your minds set and fresh. Go ahead and read question one to yourself. I'll just give you like 10 seconds. Okay, so this first question just has to do with the background and the authorship of the original oath. It was written in the 4th century before the Common Era. So if you're kind of counting backwards from 0, you're looking at 300s, what we used to call BC, but we often call BCE these days, before the Common Era. So, okay. It's often associated with Hippocrates, and it's more, he became, I guess, the most famous physician in a school that was a part of a religious group that operated out of a temple. But he didn't actually write it himself, because he lived about 100 years before it was written down. Okay, so he kind of probably inaugurated the community that eventually generated the oath. Maybe it's his ethos that's embedded in it, but he's not the literal author. Okay, so the oath was written on the island of Kos in Greece, and when I looked it up online, it's spelled with a K. This often happens. There's some alternative spellings. So yeah, you can go with COS or KOS. That's fine. Okay, so let's look at that first substantive question. What happened to the temple that Hippocrates and his group of physicians were a part of? And basically, it was destroyed during the Christianization of Greece. The textbook doesn't give the specific year or even the specific century in which this occurred. But it's important to note that this is kind of ironic because Christian peoples ended up adopting variations of the Hippocratic Oath for many centuries, all the way down into the 20th century. So one of history's little ironies. And for that last question, medical practitioners on costs, they belong to the Pythagorean cult. Pythagoras, of course, was a very famous mathematician. So if you take math, you might have come across the Pythagorean theorem. It has to do with the sides of a triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Um, but he was also it turns out, a religious figure, and he started a cult. And if you can believe it, the cult had a lot to do with literally worshiping numbers and other mathematical objects. But apparently, they also dove into other sciences besides mathematics and had a school of medicine there as well. Perhaps loosely defined, they had some training in medicine. The healing arts. Let's call them the healing arts. They trained in the healing arts. All right. Okay, let's look at that second question. And again, I think it's a little bit more efficient if I just have you read the question to yourself quietly, really quick, and then we can talk about it. Okay. So again, this question concerns the section entitled the Oath of Initiation. Um, Now, look at that first question. The Pythagorean cult, they actually didn't think their physicians should share medical knowledge without those outside the cult. Um, Now, I'm not sure why that was, but I do know this. The Pythagorean cult was something called a mystery cult. So mystery cults, as the name indicates, they often gather a rather exclusive and small group of people, not always small, but often small. And the cult or the religious group, they're centered around this kind of knowledge only members of the cult gain, but they generally are hesitant to share that knowledge. So this is a key difference between how they thought of medical knowledge. And look at question B. Uh, Nowadays, just using mainstream American doctors, uh, we tend to think the more the public is educated about health, the better. And it's even part of a doctor's job, especially in relation to their patients, to explain what's happening at a level the patient can understand. And yeah, it's definitely encouraged that even beyond the doctor's own immediate patients, the general knowledge of health and treatment, that this gets widely disseminated throughout the culture. Okay, and look at that part C. Did those who wrote the Hippocratic Oath and those who modified it to suit the needs and beliefs of their own culture keep religious and moral ideals separate? No, historically, those two have never been kept separate. People's general beliefs about reality, whether that be religious or secular, and the moral ideals and values that flow out of those more ideological religious or secular beliefs. Here we're focusing on the religious. They've always infiltrated medicine to some degree and have certainly affected at least how the patient views acceptable and unacceptable treatment, and historically, yeah, the doctors as well. And we'll get into that a little more below. All right. So the Hippocratic Oath, there's the oath of initiation. And then there's the code section, which concerns more of the specific medical advice. All right. Um, Go ahead and read question 3 silently again. Again, it just saves a little bit of breath on my part, and it's just more efficient. Okay. So let me just comment on just this kind of introductory part to question 3. So the Pythagoreans, they were a religious cult, and they were also motivated to help the general population by practicing their medical arts. But when they did those medical practices, uh, sometimes there was tension between what their religious beliefs indicated should happen and what would have been best for the patient. So, for example, uh, a certain sort of doctor wasn't allowed to perform surgery, even though that doctor would have been capable of doing so. And that prohibition had little to do with medicine itself and what was best for the health of the patient, what was medically necessary. It was more a relic of some sort of Pythagorean notion of defilements or impurity or something like that. Uh, so this is worth noting because often a person's or groups or even medical professionals, the values they generally hold, they do have the potential to conflict with what is best for the patient. Uh, so it's good to be aware of that potential conflict. Maybe that's one of the takeaway points from this. Okay, so continuing on with question 3. Can you think of an example of a medical case or general moral issue today in which persons base medical decision making on spiritual or religious beliefs that are not purely medical? Now, for those of you who are going to go on and work in the medical field, it's important to see that the answer to this question is yes, because you're going to be navigating, real life patients who are bringing with them not only a set of medical needs and concerns, but they're also going to be bringing with them a value system. Okay. So the answer to A is that it's actually very common for people to adopt a perspective on a medically relevant moral issue that is informed by their spiritual or religious beliefs, whatever phraseology you prefer. And I just list some examples here, and hopefully you came up with your own examples, or yeah, I'm sure you did in response to this question. So, for example, some people avoid the use of birth control for religious reasons. Others avoid having a deceased body autopsied because they think it may affect the person in the afterlife. Others, famously, a group called the Jehovah's Witness, they'll reject blood transfusions, kind of like the Pythagoreans. I think there's something contaminating about receiving other people's blood into your body. And just think of the issues of abortion and euthanasia. Euthanasia concerns, maybe pulling the plug on someone with a terminal illness to let the disease kill them, or in Oregon and other states, maybe even prescribing poison to end someone's life and therefore suffering rather deliberately. Whether or not a person thinks these are morally permissible, it's not completely determined by their religious views, but that's often an input in the conversation. People often form these convictions, uh, in that context. And then part B asks, what are some possible downsides to basing medical decisions on non-health related concerns? And the most obvious downside would be a person might forego a treatment that is more effective because of some sort of religious conviction. So the Jehovah's Witness, again, not to pick on them or anything like that, but they do have this belief that there's something morally wrong with receiving a blood transfusion. And of course, in certain contexts, um, that's going to greatly reduce the odds of surviving an illness. So that would be the most obvious downside. Okay, go ahead. Well, question four is kind of short. We can kind of read this one together. Did doctors operating under the Hippocratic Oath swear to base medical decisions on their own best judgment alone, or did the patient get a say in what should happen to them as well? Similarly, how do the authors define this term paternalism? And the answer is only the doctor's judgment mattered. Doctors, up until I'd say the 1950s, 1960s, even in the United States, doctors were trained to just simply use their own judgment regarding which was what was best for the patient. The patient's desires, preferences, needs weren't really consulted, and the doctor would do their best to do what's best for the patient. But according to the doctor's own value system, the patient didn't really get to have a say. And this is what we call paternalism. So, part B here, in a paternalist system, a doctor or other governing body simply overrides or ignores the wishes of the patient for the purpose of trying to benefit them. Now, in modern mainstream medicine, the patient has a much larger role in decision making, and we will explore that in coming weeks. So, this has shifted again up until the 1950s and 60s. A paternalistic model was the dominant model, but since then, there's been a move towards, for example, informed consent. So before a patient undergoes a procedure, they have to be taught all the potential upsides and downsides, everything from medical effects to costs, life expect like the likely effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the treatment. So things are shifting away from this, or have shifted away from this paternalistic system. But historically, paternalism was the dominant trend, and it's embedded in the Hippocratic Oath. All right, let's go on to question 5. This concerns Percival's Code of 1803 and the American Medical Association Code of 1847. So we get such questions here as who asked Percival to write a code of ethics and for what reason? So the answer is here in A. Percival was asked to write a code of ethics in order to mediate quarrels that were being had amongst doctors regarding who should make decisions during a typhoid epidemic in Manchester, England. And it was the physicians in their treatment center who asked him to write the code. So one of the first really influential codes to come out of Britain. It's interesting that it was designed, didn't even really have the patient in view. It was more to settle disputes amongst doctors. And the two defining features of the code, this part did affect patients, were the motive of doing what is best for the patient. Okay, so that's a little unlike the Hippocratic Oath in its original form. Let me just scroll back to that. Oh, where'd it go? Like, for example, let's look at that prohibition against surgery. Well, that could have been what is best for the patient. But they had already decided not to do surgery, even if they were capable of doing so, because they were afraid it could kind of like corrupt them spiritually in some sense. Oh, where'd that go? Here we go. I will not use the knife, even upon those suffering from stones, but I will leave it to those who are trained in this craft. And again, the reason not everybody was trained in the craft had to do not so much with the medical needs of the patients, but with the functioning of the Pythagorean cult. Okay. So at least by the time you get to Percival's code, the primary goal is to benefit the patient, but they did not involve the patient in decision making. So that's the this paternalistic attitude I make reference to in 5b. All right, now question C. This question concerns the section, the collapse of the Hippocratic tradition. And there are three challenges that have been brought against the core idea of the Hippocratic Oath that the physician should be the one whose judgment should be followed in order to benefit the patient and not the patient's own judgment. Okay. Now, the first challenge is that it's not very rational to think that a doctor knows what is best for the patient. In medical decision making, there are a lot of trade-offs involved in whether or not to pursue a specific course of treatment. So here's an example. Let's say one has cancer and it's pretty bad at this point, so they can get chemotherapy. It's not expected to ward off the cancer forever, but maybe can extend the person's life for, let's just say, a year. But let's also say that year will be a really hard year, a year full of suffering. It's not clear at all that it's better to have the chemotherapy that's really painful and will only extend one's life for a year than it is to simply reject chemotherapy and maybe accept something called palliative care instead, where the idea is to prevent pain and kind of make you comfortable. Of course, you're likely to die younger than you would if you take the chemo. But notice there's no like calculus that could tell you what's the right thing to do. There's just too many little factors that the patient might want to take into account. Like, for example, maybe the patient's lived a long life and they just don't want that extra pain and struggle at the end. They want to focus instead on saying goodbye to their family, putting their affairs in order. Or maybe the person's kind of young and maybe they have the opposite inclination. They want to stick around as long as possible. The patient is in a far better position than the doctor to make that kind of choice. So that's why paternalism is often the wrong way to go in medicine. So the text uses this word subjective, and I define subjective here. So a choice is subjective, that if different people can make different choices, each of which are reasonable to make. So this is a case in where it's reasonable to accept the treatment, reasonable to reject it. So it really is kind of up to the patient and their own situation and values to make that choice. Okay, now the second challenge has to do with the fact that there are moral obligations that a physician has towards a patient besides simply minimizing harm and maximizing medical benefit. So patients' rights include more than to receive treatment that's likely to be effective or the best treatment available or something like that. Another obligation that's completely left out of the Hippocratic tradition would be an obligation to tell the truth to the patient, even when doing so could be painful. So again, we have to go back a little bit here, but back in the 1950s, perhaps into the 1960s, doctors often tried to spare the patient emotional pain by hiding medical information. This may have spared the patient some pain in the short run or now, but it's still the case that one has a right to know what one's medical condition is nonetheless. So we owe things to patients as medical providers, assuming you go on to be a medical provider. Yes, of course, your goal is to benefit and have the best impact on their health, but you can't sacrifice other moral obligations to that end, even if you think they're going to make an irrational decision. You still have to tell them all the options and let them make that decision. So that's called autonomy. We'll dive into that in coming weeks. That'll also compete with this goal of just maximizing benefit. All right, and the third challenge involves cases in which a physician has obligations to the welfare of other people besides the patient. So that's not really in the Hippocratic Oath tradition either. So just think of a patient that might have a transmittable illness, maybe an STD. It's a debatable question. Should the doctor, let's say you have a patient, and let's say you know that patient has contracted the AIDS virus. Your primary job, of course, is to treat and advise the patient. But let's say you know that patient lives with someone that they have a sexual relationship with. The Hippocratic Oath tradition does not discuss whether or not you should tell that other person who's affected about the illness. So that's kind of what they have in mind with this third challenge. There are cases in which the health concerns go beyond the specific patient that is being treated. Okay. All right. So these three challenges to the Hippocratic tradition have caused, as the book says, its collapse. It's still a goal of medicine to not harm patients. That part is kind of stuck around. But the paternalism associated with the oath and other values that are significant that have been mentioned in relation to the second and third challenge, those are included in more recent codes of ethics. So that's the sense in which the Hippocratic tradition collapsed. It's been modified and elaborated upon. All right. All right. And then question B, in what documents does the term patient's rights and informed consent first appear? And this is going to be in the Nuremberg Code of 1946 and the American Hospital Association Patients Bill of Rights in 1973, and also the American Medical Association Principles of 1980. So just notice those dates. This is pretty far on in history, especially the American Hospital Association Patient Bill of Rights. That's 1973. And then that second American Medical Association Principles, that was in 1980. So this robust notion that patients have rights, and this is built into documents that guide things like the American Medical Association. This is fairly late in coming in history, but I hope you can see that's progress. It's good to give informed consent to a patient before insisting on a procedure. So that is progress on the Hippocratic Oath. Okay, so let me just close up here. Okay, so I'm going to upload this video to YouTube, and I will put a link in the same area where the answers to the reading questions are. And again, you can always have the choice. You can read the answers, you can watch the video, you can do both. And what you want to do is kind of check out your own answers and see if you got things right. And maybe keep some notes where you got things wrong. Maybe write a note to yourself. And that'll put you in a good position to learn the material. And practically speaking, that'll translate into success in regards to tests and essays. All right, good to see you, and we'll talk soon.